The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be Africa's biggest moment on the world stage. 10 nations, a record number, all qualified for the same tournament for the first time ever. But right now, weeks into this World Cup, a very different story is unfolding behind the scenes. Visa denials, five-figure bonds, a referee turned away at the border, and entire fan bases sitting at home instead of in the stands. So is Africa's breakthrough World Cup turning into something else entirely? Let's get into it. This tournament was always going to be historic for African football. 10 countries punched their tickets, up from just 5 in recent editions, meaning Africa now makes up more than a fifth of the entire 48-team field. For a continent that lives and breathes football, that number alone should have been the story of the summer. Instead, the headlines have been dominated by something else: United States immigration policy. As co-host alongside Canada and Mexico, the U.S. brought its own visa rules into a tournament that's supposed to belong to the whole world, and those rules have hit African nations especially hard. Reports indicate visa bond requirements as high as $15,000 were floated for fans from several African countries, including Algeria, Cameroon, Ghana, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. For context, that's dozens of times the average disposable income in some of these nations. For most fans, that number alone ends the conversation before it even starts. On top of that, mass visa rejections have been reported. In Ghana alone, hundreds of fans, officials, and even club owners say they were denied, with rejection letters reportedly citing vague reasons. Senegal is competing at this World Cup for the first time in the country's history without an officially organized fan group able to travel and support them. Here's where things get interesting. This isn't just about fans missing flights. It's starting to raise real questions about whether the World Cup experience is the same for everyone, or whether geography and passport color quietly decide who gets to be part of it. If you're finding this breakdown useful, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button now. It genuinely helps this channel keep covering stories like this one all tournament long. Let's go deeper into the logistics side, because the visa issue isn't standing alone. It's layered on top of other obstacles that have piled up on African teams and supporters specifically. Take the case of Omar Artan, a Somali official named CAF's best referee for the past year and set to make history as the first Somali ever to officiate at a World Cup. He arrived in the United States, went through additional inspection, and was turned back at the border, ending his tournament before it began. South Africa's national team had its own scare. The squad's travel was delayed over visa processing issues just days before the tournament started, prompting the country's own sports minister to publicly call the situation embarrassing, before later admitting some of the fault sat with the federation itself. Ivory Coast organizers hope to bring around 500 fans across the Atlantic. Senegal's federation has openly called the absence of their home support, quote, regrettable, while stressing they understand host nations set their own immigration laws. Multiple federations have echoed a version of the same sentiment, disappointed but careful not to frame it as outright conflict. This matters because African football has historically been incredibly vocal when it feels sidelined. There's a real history here worth remembering because it puts the current situation in a different light. Back in 1964, more than a dozen African federations actually withdrew from World Cup qualifying entirely after FIFA gave the continent a single combined playoff spot against Asia for the 1966 tournament. That walkout worked. FIFA was eventually forced to guarantee Africa its own dedicated slots, a decision that shaped every World Cup since. The bigger issue right now is that this time the response has looked completely different. Africa's continental body, CAF, has so far stayed largely quiet on the travel restrictions and visa bond reports affecting its own qualified nations and their fans. Commentators and op-ed writers across the continent have pointed out that silence directly, asking why the same governing body that once fought FIFA over fairness in 1964 hasn't taken a public stance now.
What makes 2026 different isn't just the policies themselves, it's the scale. 10 nations, millions of fans, in a tournament FIFA has marketed as the richest and most watched in history, all running into immigration roadblocks that didn't exist in quite the same way at previous World Cups. Quick reminder if you haven't already, subscribing to this channel means you'll catch every twist in this story as the tournament moves forward. It really does make a difference for this channel, so thank you if you've already done that. Now, let's talk about what this actually feels like on the ground, because numbers and policy only tell part of the story. African fans are widely considered some of the most passionate supporters in the sport. Stadiums packed with color, noise, and energy that follows their teams from the opening whistle to the final one. That atmosphere is part of what makes African teams dangerous on the pitch. Players have spoken for years about the lift they get from a stadium full of home support, the kind of energy that can turn a tense match in their favor. Senegal's Federation Secretary General put it plainly, saying matches are ultimately won on the field, but acknowledged the impact of playing without that wall of support behind them. Think about it from a player's perspective. You spent years working toward this exact tournament, and when you finally step onto the pitch, the stands that should be filled with your country's flags and your country's voices are largely empty, or filled with fans who simply live closer and manage to get in. For supporters back home, it's a different kind of frustration. Many had saved for months, in some cases years, hoping to follow their nation to its first World Cup in a record-breaking African contingent. Watching that dream get stopped by a visa rejection letter rather than anything happening on the field leaves a very particular sting. And it's not only fans. Journalists covering several African federations have also reported entry issues, meaning even the media telling these stories has, at times, struggled to physically be there to tell them. This raises a bigger question that goes beyond football. Would this kind of treatment change how invested you'd be in a tournament if your own country's supporters were largely shut out of attending? So, where does this go from here? There are a few realistic paths, and it's worth walking through them honestly rather than predicting disaster. The best-case scenario is fairly straightforward. Continued media attention and pressure from federations could push host authorities to ease some restrictions, similar to how the visa bond requirement was reportedly paused for ticketed fans back in May. If that kind of flexibility expands, later matches and future tournaments could look very different for affected nations. There's also a version where CAF, facing growing criticism for its silence, decides to take a more formal stance, whether that's a public statement, a push for fairer visa processing, or working with FIFA on guarantees for future hosting bids. Some commentators have specifically called for exactly that kind of pressure. The more difficult scenario is that this becomes the new normal. If visa bonds, denials, and travel restrictions continue largely unaddressed, future World Cups hosted in countries with strict immigration policies could face the same imbalance, where qualifying for the tournament doesn't guarantee your fans can actually attend it. FIFA's own position throughout is that host governments, not FIFA itself, control who enters their borders. That's technically accurate, but it leaves African federations and fans caught in the middle of a system they have very little power to change on their own. One more ask before we wrap up. If this kind of football news coverage is something you want more of, subscribing genuinely tells this channel to keep making it. It takes 2 seconds and helps more than you'd think. So, here's where things stand. Africa arrived at this World Cup with its biggest roster of nations ever, a genuine milestone for the continent. But that milestone has been overshadowed by visa bonds, mass rejections, a referee turned back at the border, and fan bases sitting this one out for reasons that have nothing to do with football. CAF's relative silence, compared to its own history of standing up to FIFA, has only added to the criticism. And while no federation has walked away from the tournament itself, the frustration being voiced publicly by players, officials, and fans is impossible to ignore. Which side of this story do you think wins out? The optimistic path where things improve, or the harder path where this becomes the new normal for future tournaments? And which African federation do you think has handled this situation the best so far? Drop your take in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it. If you made it this far, you clearly care about how this World Cup is unfolding off the pitch as much as on it. So do one last thing for me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next update in this story. This situation is still developing, and as always, football never stays quiet for long. See you in the next one.